Ready.
All right. Happy Friday, everybody. Hope you're having a lovely day. We certainly are on this end. I think we have another excellent discussion that's about to take place. Just a few quick announcements before then. Tomorrow, or not tomorrow, I'm ahead of myself. Sunday at 8 o'clock, we will be joined by Stephen Bassett, who is he's a UFO lobbyist. We're going to kind of be going into the legal aspect of UFOs in this edition of Sci-Fi Sunday. So make sure you join us for that. That will be fun. And then again on the 24th at 6 o'clock, we have Matt Dillahunty, who will be having a discussion with Inspiring Philosophy on Is Religion a Positive Influence on Society Today? So make sure you catch us for that. That's April 24th, a Tuesday at 6 o'clock. And now I will send it over to Steve, who will introduce our guest tonight and get it going.
Hey, welcome everybody. Tonight we actually have King Crocoduck back with us to discuss a little bit about epistemology and abiogenesis with Dr. Cy Garte. This particular discussion is kind of a continuation left over from when Dean Esme was on talking to King Crocoduck, and Dr. Garte wanted to kind of expound upon that and talk a little bit about epistemology and I think a little bit about abiogenesis. So I kind of put them both up there and they can kind of dive into either field, because obviously they're so vast that there's no possible way they can have an in-depth discussion about either one of those topics. So this is going to be kind of pick one with a little bit of mixture with the other one. So we're just going to start right off with Dr. Garte, if you can introduce himself, because if you don't know him, he's been on many other channels. He's been on Aaron Ra's channel, had a great discussion with him. He has a PhD in biochemistry, I believe it is.
Yes.
So go ahead and introduce yourself and your positions, and then we'll have to Casey do the same.
Okay. Thank you, Steve and Carl, for having me on, and thank you to KC for agreeing to have this discussion. As Steve said, I'm a long-time scientist in the field of biochemistry and environmental health. I recently retired after spending about 6 years at NIH. Before that, I was an academic professor. And I was raised as an atheist and was an atheist for a good part of my life. I came to Christianity only about 15 years ago, and remain an active scientist, although being retired means for me, means you keep doing what you've been doing, but you don't get paid. So in that sense, I'm retired, but I'm still working. And I've been very interested in matters of science and faith and how they can interact. I just became editor of an online magazine called God and Nature, which is put out by an organization called the American Scientific Affiliation, ASA. And it's a group of scientists who are Christians. They're active in the sciences, largely in academia, but not only. And this is a quarterly magazine which presents essays and poetry and other material related to the science and faith dialogue. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. And Casey, can you kind of, again, refresh people's memory about your positions and who you are, and also maybe do a lead-in with the conversation you kind of had with Dean that kind of brought all this to bear between your discussion you're going to be having with Dr. Garte tonight?
Sure. Well, I'm just a guy on the internet, but I know a couple things about science. I teach some of the basic science, debunk some pseudoscience on my YouTube channel. And I had a discussion with one Dean Esme recently, Red Pill Religion, who seemed to take issue with the atheist community on YouTube. But beyond that, there wasn't much fruitful discussion to be had. It was mostly just noise, to be honest. But I do like good discourse. I do like good conversations. I am an atheist. I don't believe that there's any good reason or good evidence to believe in a God. But contra what some people think, this is not some speculative metaphysical position. It's not like I'm just beginning with the presupposition that Christians are stupid or something. I just like to have these kinds of conversations, and I come from that position. So that's basically that.
So, Dr. Garte, you kind of wanted to have a conversation with Casey, so I'm just going to turn it right over to you, and you can kind of continue from the conversation he was having with Dean, because I think that they were discussing some things on dealing with epistemology that Dean said that he basically wasn't equipped to talk about, and they had friends that were more willing to have those kind of conversations. So, kind of want to take it from there and maybe refresh the conversation that they were having and why you had wanted to have a conversation with Casey about this.
Sure. First of all, Dean and I are friends, internet friends, for a while, but my style and his style are quite different, as he will admit. I tend not to be confrontational if I can avoid it. It's just my scientific experience and training, and Casey will know about this. It's very rare for people to yell at each other when they're academic scientists. So sometimes I have found Twitter conversations a little difficult. Because they don't fit into that paradigm very well. Mm-hmm. But other than that, the reason I wanted to take over a bit from where the conversation seemed to end between Dean and KC is that at that point, there was a discussion about methodological naturalism as the epistemology that explains the natural world. And I was somewhat surprised that Dean was arguing against that view, because I think that that's absolutely true. There's no question that methodological naturalism is the epistemological tool to understand everything about nature and the world of the natural world as we know it. So that was the first thing I wanted to say, is that I'm in complete agreement with Casey about that proposition. And I think that admitting that proposition does nothing to diminish the importance and the reality of faith and the existence of God, etc., simply because God and everything related to the supernatural is by definition not part of the natural. And therefore, nothing is being given up by agreeing that methodological naturalism, by definition, is the way to find the truth of nature. And frankly, I couldn't be a scientist if I didn't agree with that. I wouldn't be able to ever do an experiment, get a result, or publish anything. And I speak not only for myself here, but for the vast majority of mainstream scientists who are also Christians, and that includes a lot of famous people who you all know or have heard of. So that's how I wanted to, start this, was to basically say, yes, methodological naturalism is the operating method of choice to understand the natural world according to the methods of science.
Okay.
See you there. All right.
Yeah, but
so okay. Now we can all go home.
Hey, thank you for joining, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow. Can we sing Kumbaya?
Basically. Yeah. And, people who reject methodological naturalism as sort of the basis of science, they're not found, exclusively among Christians. I have a video series called The Science Wars. I don't know if you remember anything about that back in the 90s and early 2000s. Mm-hmm. But there was a set of scholars within the academy, and I'm sort of talking about the history of these engagements. And they thought that scientific practice is too restrictive, that the methods that are employed are used in order to propagate an unjust state of affairs, and that the scientific process is fundamentally biased in favor of particular demographics, which is complete nonsense. So they also tried to introduce these kind of alternative methodologies, sort of employing this idealist phenomenological approach where you would confront with people's lived experiences in order to get the truth out of matter. They would engage in deconstructionism, where they would look at the text and be able to sort of psychoanalyze whoever authored the text in order to try to understand something about the paper being written. And this wasn't really even their focus was on scientific papers So they would look at some scientific publication and they would use deconstructive analysis. They wouldn't look at the content of the paper, but they would try to investigate the structure of the scientist's consciousness in order to, and it just doesn't work. There's nothing fruitful that comes of that.
Well, this is going to be very boring for everybody listening, but I'm in absolute total agreement with what you just said. And I've also had a chance to look at some of your videos and some of your work on this issue. And I will just summarize it by saying that politics, religion, and anything else that is not scientific simply doesn't belong in the scientific world. I'm very happy to see you talk about Lysenko as the poster child for this. And of course, the result of Lysenko's activities was to basically destroy Russian biology for 2 generations. And we're in great danger of that happening. I agree completely. We're in danger of this. I remember that era very well. I was an active researcher at the time, and I had some confrontations with a few people using exactly that approach. And I think it's important for all scientists, whatever they believe outside of the lab, to resist this kind of what I would call fairly insidious influence from any direction. So
you're right. This is going to be a boring conversation. We're just
you seem to get along. You seem to agree on a lot of things. Let me ask you, so we can kind of like maybe find something that you maybe have some disagreement with. Now, Dr. Garte, you obviously accept methodological naturalism. Right? We all agree upon that. Do you accept some kind of like physicalism or materialism in those lines, or you're a substance dualist? And where do you fall on the lines of that? Maybe you can talk about that. Phenomenalism, things of that nature.
I don't know the definitions of all the isms. I have to admit that my knowledge and expertise in the philosophy of science is limited. I've never been able to read philosophy of science because I frankly don't know what they're talking about half the time.
I don't think they do either. Yeah, I'm on board with you
but
on that.
I would say that I'm not so much a dualist as I don't know if there's a word for this, but a multipleist. And what I mean by that is that I've come to believe, and this is where we probably will begin our disagreement, I've come to believe that the natural world is not all that exists. And if that's true, then methodological naturalism no longer applies to the world which is outside of the natural world, if such a world exists.
So, an ontological pluralist, perhaps, maybe a good
that sounds good. So I would say that there's not only one epistemology that needs to be used for everything one does, and I'm kind of disappointed that so many philosophers seem to say you have to choose one epistemology for everything, and that includes scientific information, the evaluation of art, study of great literature, religion. It's all one epistemology, and I just don't understand that, because to me, the way we know Shakespeare or the way we know a poet, any poet, whatever that means to know something in the humanities, is quite different from the way we know, how DNA works. It's different. The epistemology is different. So I'm perfectly comfortable accepting a subjective epistemology for the places where it applies and rejecting it for where it doesn't. So I reject it, as I was just saying, completely for anything related to scientific investigation. And just as an aside, I'll say that I think Casey would agree with me there, that there are many people who call themselves scientists who kind of stray from methodological science when it comes to certain aspects of describing the world of nature. But having said that, when it comes to other issues, and that includes anything that fits into the humanities, which is a perfectly valid field of scholarship, no, I don't see the application of methodological naturalism working there. And that's where I would see a more subjective epistemology prevailing.
Okay. I think I would broadly agree. I think it is true that it's not appropriate to apply methodological naturalism to try to understand the work of Shakespeare, although I have heard of recent developments in the digital humanities, some very interesting things happening. For, what was her name? The Agatha Christie. They were able to, there was a paper, they were able to run all of the words that she used throughout her books, and they would sort of log the frequency with which they were used, and sort of the parts of the books where these words would be used. And they saw that over time, the use of these words were less and less frequent. And from this, they were able to deduce that it's possible that Christie had Alzheimer's later on in life.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think that's an interesting kind of synthesis of methodological
it's
naturalism.
interesting, but it tells us nothing about her stories.
Right.
It doesn't tell us anything about Miss Marple or I forgot the male. Oh, Poirot. It doesn't tell us, anything about their methods, the fictional art, the storylines that went into this writing process. And to do that, it's a whole different process. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there are times when measurement and objective measures are useful in the arts, in philosophy, in other fields related to that, even in theology, in fact, surprisingly enough. But then there are times when it isn't, and that's when you have to go to another approach.
How about if I can?
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think that in the last debate, I was speaking of the methodology as being the most fundamental, the most important thing. It's the process by which we acquire information that sort of sets the agenda for what we can talk about and what we can sensibly say exists. So, using one process for the scientific enterprise, a different process for textual analysis, that seems perfectly reasonable. But I think it's worth wondering what is the function of a particular methodology? What is it that orients our decision to approach a problem or a subject in one manner versus another manner? And I think that the answer to that is there are certain values that we have, certain intellectual virtues that we apply in one direction versus another, and these are going to differ in terms of what it is we're trying to arrive at. So in the case of science, we do value models that have greater explanatory and predictive power. And so this is going to orient our approach, the manner in which we're going to try to acquire information about the natural world. There's going to be certain standards that we want to try to meet, certain, just generally be able to get good information out of this. But it may very well, I think it is the case that we have a completely different set of values when we want to try to understand, the works of Shakespeare or the works of Christie. And so the approach of the same methodology when the values are oriented in a different way is, of course, inappropriate. So I guess the question is, when we are talking about the existence of God, we are presumably applying some alternative non-natural methodology. And it would be interesting to know what are the values that inform that methodology. What is it that you're trying to achieve when talking about when employing whatever approach you employ to arrive at the conclusion of God?
Well, that's a big question. I think it's been said by many people. I wouldn't say all Christians, but by a large number of Christians, that, and I agree with this, this is also my view, that there are many reasons to believe in God. And let me just say, I'm not an apologist, but I do think that some of the apologists have some very good points when they talk about reasons to believe. That's even the name of one of the organizations which we were talking about earlier. And the problem with, so the good part of that is that there are things about the universe, things about human nature that appear to be pointers, it's a word that's used often in this field, to the existence of something beyond what we can measure, what we see in the natural world. And when we take that and then try to understand the supernatural world, we have a very difficult time using anything that resembles scientific method or any experiment that will prove the existence of God as is often demanded. And what is often said, and again, I agree with this, is that, because this happened to me in my journey, finding pointers to God in the natural world, whatever they may be, and we can get into those specifics later or shortly, that's not enough. I don't believe. It certainly was not enough for me to become a believer in God. What was also necessary, and I think it's true for many people, is a personal experience which is subjective, and that's where the subjective epistemology comes in. A personal experience with God or Jesus Christ or whatever the religious entity may be, depending on where you are and what you're starting to believe in. And that experience is what eventually led me, and I think leads many other people, to a belief or to faith in a God that cannot be proven scientifically, but the result of the subjective experience is such that it is a absolutely firm and I would say irrefutable belief for me myself. So in other words, the way I feel about the existence of God and the fact of Jesus Christ as my Savior is pretty much as strong in my own view as my belief that, genes are made of DNA and they code for the phenotype of cells, which is scientific fact. So even though I can't say that Jesus Christ being my Savior is a scientific fact, I believe it as a fact in the same strength that I believe the scientific facts.
So when I apply my methodology, or when I before that, when I think about what it is that I value and what it is that I want to get out of my appraisal of the world, what I really want, the only reason I want truth ultimately is that I can better navigate the world. I think about truth in functional terms. And through my investigations, we all come across these cognitive biases. We all come across these famous illusions, and we find ourselves doubting the well, not really infallibility even, but just the internal logic of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Once you're exposed to things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, I don't know if you read this excellent book. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. I forgot the author, but
I've heard of it, but I didn't read it. No,
it's a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about all these mental shortcuts we take, all of these mental heuristics that get us to jump from A to C without really going through B.
Right.
And being exposed to all of these different cognitive mechanisms, I get a little bit paranoid. I think, how do I know I'm not bullshitting myself? How do I know that? Yeah. Because that can compromise my ability to navigate the world. And since I value being able to navigate the world as well as possible, I want good filters on what comes in as good information and what gets kept out as not bad information, but information that still requires more justification. So
yeah,
I guess,
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, I completely sympathize with that, and I went through the same process. I was an atheist who experienced very strange emotional feelings of connection with something, which I didn't know what it was, and I went through exactly what you're describing, and I said, no, this is my brain playing tricks on me, and I was a very militant atheist, by the way. I was really a militant anti-theist, and I certainly had no intention of ever giving that up. And I just felt that exactly what you said, that, there was no way I was going to be fooled by the vagaries of my, mental subjectivity. And how did that change? Well, the way it changed, and here we may get into some meatier discussion, is I began seeing things that I was learning about in science, largely in biology, but to some extent in physics, that kind of made me think, well, it certainly made me reevaluate my original view, which was very materialistic. My father, for example, was a very strong materialist. He was a chemist, and he absolutely had no patience with anything of a spiritual or even psychological nature. And I kind of absorbed that, and I felt that, the universe is easily explainable. But then I started learning things that kind of threw a little bit of a monkey wrench into that, and I began seeing that, and of course I don't have to tell you about this, but for the audience, there are things in physics that tell us that there are some things we cannot know, like the position and the momentum of an electron, at any particular time, which is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And that kind of threw me a little bit. Some of the results from quantum mechanics, which I heard you say in your second video as an introduction to the soon-to-be released third one, is insane. I mean, quantum mechanics is a little bit, it's good science, obviously, because we rely on it for so many things. It definitely is true. It definitely works. But it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around. Now, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. What it meant to me was, well, maybe we don't have it all wrapped up. Maybe there's some stuff out there that's a little bit more, how should we put it, mystical. This didn't make me a theist. This didn't lead me to believe in the supernatural. What it did was it led me to question whether, with all the scientific information we are gaining in various fields, do we really understand what we're talking about? And even though, as we know, the math is fine and we can describe, for example, string theory with 11 dimensions, nobody knows what that actually means or looks like. We're way beyond that stage, and we probably passed it with Einstein. But
just really quickly, for the record,
ahead.
I myself am not a subscriber to string theory, at least not as nothing more than a mathematical theory at this stage.
Well, right. I think a lot of people agree with you, even in the field.
Yes, so please continue.
Yeah, no, I think then, I kind of took shelter in biology, which I thought was a little bit more, down to earth, and only to discover, no, not at all. Biology, I think, leads us to questions which are just, and this could eventually get into the abiogenesis story, but it leads us to questions which are just seem intransigent. Now, I'm not talking about God of the gaps, because God of the gaps, which I'm always accused of doing, suggests that if you don't know something, you say God did it and we're done. And that's not at all what I want to do, because I don't base any of my beliefs on what we don't know, but only on what we do know. Because what we're learning and finding out is what I consider to be pointers to something else beyond the natural world. Now, do I know that that's true? Putting on my scientist hat? No, of course not. These are ideas. But when I admit to myself that I believe that it's true, everything falls into place. There's a very good quote from C.S. Lewis, which is, I believe in God the way I believe in the sun, not just because I see it, but by its light, I see everything else. And when I became a believer, I began to feel that everything made sense. Not that we had all the answers. There's still, the questions are still there. And if it were proven that God existed and created the world and created life and everything else, I would still want to know how. what method did he use to do this? Because if God is the creator, it would be nice to know how he did it, if we can understand that. I don't know if we can, but the scientist in me still wants to know what actually happened.
Casey, do you want to respond to that, or maybe I can kind of like ask some questions that people are in the audience, because it seems, like I said, it seems you guys agree on a lot of things. I'm noticing there's a strong correspondence between both your guys' positions, and I think that's probably because both of you are intelligent, educated people. One of the questions that we have actually right now is somebody had asked via Streamlabs. Thank you, by the way, Godless Cranium. What evidence for Christianity does Sci find the most convincing? And love your show, guys. Thank you. Maybe kind of address, because you said something interesting that I thought was noted to me. Because you said your position is now irrefutable. I think the word is a word that you use. And you went from atheist to anti-theist, and now you have an irrefutable position. So taking the scientific approach, do you have a falsification criteria for that irrefutable understanding, or you don't apply the scientific method?
He's employing the subjectivist.
Subjectivist.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Which is fine, and I'm fine with that. So maybe you can explain to people that in that case, if you're taking a subjectivist approach, and what is it about what you've discovered in quantum or discovered that has convinced you of some type of either deification or God or Jesus? What led you to that particular conclusion?
Well, again, what my questioning about the natural world led me to was not a belief in God. It was a rejection of strong atheism. In other words, I no longer found it tenable to say, which I used to, there is no God, there cannot be a God, and if there were, he's evil. Which is it was a pretty strong atheist position. That's how I grew up. And
I've never held such a strong position before.
Most people don't, actually.
That's an extreme position, mostly. We know a lot of atheists, and even most atheists don't have kind of extreme position.
Yeah,
although it is out there, absolutely.
I grew up in a family of communists, members of the American Communist Party, and the Communist Party is anti-theistic. It's not just atheist, and so I believe that religion was evil. A true evil in the world, and it was really important to fight against it. So I was a militant anti-theist, and what some of these holes that I found in the fabric of scientific explanation of the world kind of made me doubt. Everybody doubts what they grew up with, right? I mean, and I kind of doubted my anti-theistic faith, along with other things. And that kind of opened some doors. And what I started doing was I started reading. I started trying to learn. There was no internet. I'm much older than I look. And I was reading books about, mysticism and religion, and mostly Buddhism, because that's, it was in the the 70s, and that was going around. It was a big thing. A lot of people were becoming Buddhists, spiritual but not religious, that whole thing, New Age stuff. And it was interesting. I didn't read, none of it convinced me. I read the Gospels along with other literature. I thought the Gospels were interesting. I thought they had the ring of truth in terms of their historical context, but I didn't believe what they were saying. And then I had a series of experiences which kind of made me wonder about that, and I began looking at I began thinking that maybe God is real, but if God were real, well, should it be Allah? Should it be Yahweh? Should it be, the Buddha version of no God? Should it be Christianity? I didn't know. I had no background in any of these. And the thing that convinced me to finally answer your question, that maybe Christianity is where I wanted to go, was simply the story that God came to Earth in the form of a very simple carpenter and revolutionized the planet with a message which is so radical that most people, Christians or not, including myself, find it very hard to put it into practice. But that message was revolutionary, and I began liking that idea. I just liked the idea. And as soon as I opened my mind to that, I was now open to receive input, which I believe came directly from Christ, from God. And that came in the form of very subjective experiences, which were very convincing to me. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I know several other former atheists who had very similar kinds of experiences. Now, can I prove that those experiences were not simply, I don't know, brain chemistry going in overdrive in certain directions? I can't prove that, but I don't think so, because I'm still normal in other ways. I have not I haven't even lost my scientific ability. I mean, I published more papers after being a Christian than before. So, so that's it in a nutshell.
I would suggest, though, and this is not to discount the importance of your experiences. I'm sure they're very formative. I don't think it's necessary for a person to be insane to have experiences that are not necessarily real. From what I understand, everybody hallucinates quite regularly. Everybody hears voices under a wide variety of circumstances, and in some cases, people will even have visual hallucinations. They're able to replicate this inside a laboratory in some instances. There was a famous paper concerning REM sleep. They would have subjects. They would be monitoring their brains and waiting for them to enter into REM sleep, and they would wake them up while their brains were still in the state, and they would report seeing things that weren't there, hearing things that weren't there.
Sure. So are those real? When it's done in the lab, is that real?
I mean, what I'm basically suggesting is these are normal people. These are people like you and me. You know, they don't belong in a ward.
I never thought I was insane. But the question of whether the subjective experiences that people have are real or not depends on the definition of real. In other words, what would be an experience, for example, in the lab, the experiments you mentioned, those experiences which can be stimulated by electrophysiological stimulation, are those real experiences?
Well, I would say phenomenally they do manifest in the person's consciousness.
Okay.
But they don't manifest in other people's consciousness at that particular time. Right.
And my experiences were not caused by any artificial stimulation. I don't know what they were probably caused by something. Well, what I would say is they were caused by God.
From what I understand, though, these kinds of mental processes, they can happen like under a really wide variety of circumstances, like even under high stress or very little sleep. Lots and lots of coffee, maybe. These are the ingredients of a graduate student. I would know.
Yes, I remember it well. But consider this: if an experience like this occurs without sleep deprivation, you're right about sleep deprivation. I mean, it's well known that sleep deprivation is one method to actually achieve, satori, or to achieve higher consciousness states. Meditation, for example, in the Eastern religions, and there are techniques to stimulate that. But if it happens without that kind of stimulation, I wasn't going through any crises. I wasn't staying up late. I wasn't. I never drink coffee, so I never took drugs. So it's none of those things seem to work, and it could be imaginary. But then the question is, what is imaginary? What is, that there's so much that's imaginary, and as you well know, that we need imagination even to talk about physics. I mean, I is one of the factors in the Schrodinger equation. So, imaginary. That's sort of a joke, but anyway.
Math joke.
But,
was this something experiential that you're referring to? Was this something that you actually experienced, or was, like you said before, that you accept the narrative of the story, or is this more you accept the narrative of the story because of the experience you've had in relationship to those stories?
Well, it's hard to answer that, Steve, because I had a very gradual and slow process of coming to believe in Christ, and it was in fits and starts. So I had some dreams that were very convincing and very powerful. Of course, everybody has dreams about all kinds of things, but these were very convincing to me. But the final experience was I didn't see Jesus Christ coming down to me through the clouds. I didn't have a direct experience, of that type of something like Saul on the road to Damascus. But what happened to me was that to be honest, I was in a situation where I was driving on a highway through a fairly rural area, which had lots of Christian radio stations. And I turned on the radio hoping to get some music because I was getting tired a little bit. And I heard one of these radio preachers. And I listened for a few minutes, and I usually never listen to them. But this time I listened, not so much for what he was saying, but I was very intrigued by his style of oratory, which was quite powerful. He had a great voice, and I turned it off, and then without thinking about it at all, I said to myself, gee, I like to talk. What if I were a preacher? What would I say? And I proceeded to preach a sermon to myself, which had nothing to do with anything I'd ever thought about before. It's hard to explain the details of this, so I'll just have to give you the general view. And when I was done with this, when I was done preaching this sermon to myself, I had to pull over the car, and I was emotionally moved to the point of tears. And when I recovered and was able to drive again, I knew that I was a Christian. And I've never gone back. So I don't know what kind of experience that is. I mean, there's probably lots of good explanations for it, but it was very convincing to me.
Well, I don't want to downplay the importance of that. I don't pretend to myself be immune to emotionally powerful experiences. But when it comes to my ability to embrace the world and to be able to navigate it, I don't believe that any such experience like the one you're describing would be able to convince me. My mind would immediately turn to all of these mental shortcuts, to all of these heuristics, to all of these psychological mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And it, a lot of people, there's some atheists, quite a few, who think that the disproof of God, that lack, whatever's going to kill people's belief, it's going to come from physics, with the Big Bang, or from biology with evolution and abiogenesis or whatever. But I actually think that learning about these mental processes, learning about our cognitive shortcomings and how susceptible we are, and always being a little bit paranoid, wondering, okay, what if this time I'm bullshitting myself? What if this time I think I know something, but I don't actually know it? I think this is really the biggest danger that religious faith faces. It's a knowledge and caution of our, frankly, deeply unreliable mental processes. And they're reliable to an extent. They let us go to the moon. But in other respects, not only in terms of our perception, but also in the manner in which we reason. It's like Hume famously said, reason is a slave to the passions. We have our passions that sort of form the basis of much of our beliefs, and we kind of build rational structures around that in order to justify them.
And that I agree. Yeah, but the consequence of that is that if we are overly vigilant in mistrusting our beliefs and mistrusting our mental processes, how do we actually understand anything? How do we understand that our scientific methodology and the results we're getting in labs are true? Maybe we're all experiencing a mass hypnosis. Maybe none of what we think is real is real. In other words, we have to draw a line somewhere and say, okay, I'm going to believe in anything I discover through methodological naturalism about the world, which is good, that's fine. But we're drawing a line and we're saying, I am not going to use any other method. I'm not going to use subjective epistemology for things that I feel, because I could be fooled. Now, yes, people could be fooled, but they can be fooled. I mean, as you well know, people can be fooled thinking they're using the scientific method, and in fact, they're not. They're getting fooled by their political views or their social manipulation views, and they still think they're doing actual science, but they're not.
Yes, so I think this is where peer review and where independent verification become very important. You know, as R.N. Ra likes to say, if you can't show it, you don't know it. That rings very powerfully with me.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly an advocate of peer review. My last job at NIH I was actually one of the division directors at the review agency. So yeah, peer review is what makes science work. If there were no peer review, we would be in a terrible position. We wouldn't be able to do anything.
Right, but of course, you know, I can anticipate where you're going to go. It's like, you know, my friend tells me that he's got a new dog. You know, am I going to get the committee together and have them review his materials? You know. Well,
that's. I actually wasn't going to go there. I was going to say, but that's a good point. That would be a good place to go. I mean, there's a point where you cannot use peer review. You know,
well, you could in principle. It's just, you know, there's. I think we assign probabilities to certain propositions. Probabilities corresponding to their truth values, and whatever the stakes are in relation to the probabilities, that's going to sort of tune the investment we're willing to make, if that makes sense, in terms of how far we're willing to go to verify the proposition. So with this God proposition, the stakes are incredibly high, but you know, our capacity to appraise the evidence for it seems lacking. It seems to me a very dangerous, you know, almost even reckless kind of approach to sort of throw your money into this particular basket.
Which proposition was that? I think I missed something.
God's existence.
Oh, okay. God existence one.
Yeah. So you know, just generally speaking, yeah.
So why is that dangerous? In what respect?
Well, it's dangerous in the sense that, you know, normally when we assign our truth values to propositions, we do so after weighing the relative probability and the relative the stakes that are at play. You know, if my neighbor got a new dog, the stakes are not particularly high, so I'm not willing to invest that much material into you know, finding out whether it's correct or not. And in any event, it's a kind of mundane proposition. You know, neighbor got a new dog, whatever.
I don't see the danger in believing in God. Where would that be of any? Let's say there's no God and I'm fooling myself. Where am I exposing myself to some sort of danger or risk?
I don't mean that kind of danger. I mean a kind of intellectual danger, a danger of making this big leap of believing in this thing where the stakes are incredibly high.
Well, that's what I'm having trouble with. In other words, I don't see where the risk is. If it turns out that I'm wrong, what has been lost? I mean, what has been gained is, since I became a Christian, I've been involved in charity work. I've been very much involved.
I'm not talking about that kind of cost. I'm talking about the structure of your beliefs. Your beliefs are organized in large part around this proposition of God existing.
Right.
There's a huge investment there where this particular proposition is concerned.
And that leads to what? That leads to the lack of investment and other things. I'm not seeing why that's a problem.
The problem. I'm speaking abstractly, strictly in the terms of the structure of your beliefs.
Okay.
Right. So you planted this foundation here, and you know what happens if it occurs to you that this foundation is not necessarily warranted. Mm-hmm. What's going to go with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what do you think would go? That's my question. If I realize suddenly, if somebody came up with evidence that Jesus did not die or nor was he resurrected, and I had to call my Christian belief into question, what would be the? Are you suggesting this would be very detrimental? I'm not understanding.
Whatever the structure of your belief happens to be, whatever network of propositions you've employed into your worldview, these are going to have to be drastically reorganized.
Well, but don't we do that all the time? I mean, isn't that a healthy thing to reorganize one's structural beliefs on a regular basis?
Yes. But typically these restructurings are they take place on a much smaller scale. You shift this belief there, you shift that belief there. This particular thing is wrong, no big deal. These are what you might call low investment propositions.
Okay.
But here you have this much higher investment proposition, which is linked to a great deal of much smaller ones. And I've having spoken with a lot of Christians who became atheists, it seems to me that when they lost their God, they lost the psychological equivalent of an arm or a leg. It seemed to them like the entire world was about to fall away, like any moment now the walls were going to collapse and there would be this infinite void. And it's this terrifying experience.
I see that. But I guess in my own particular case, which is unusual, I admit, I've already made that change several times. The first time was when I decided to reject communism. That felt very lonely. I have a vague idea what you're talking about in that sense. I felt like I was betraying, a lot. I mean, this is the standard thing that everyone goes through when they lose their early faith, the early belief system. So I understand now what you're saying. But what I'm saying is that, at least for me, I've been through that 2 or 3 times already in my life, and I'm not worried about it. I doubt that I will revert back to atheism, but if it happened, I don't see. You're talking about a large investment, and I understand that, but I guess part of this is age. I'm sorry to bring this in, but when you've lived 70 years, as I have, you've already invested a lot of things in a lot of places. So it doesn't seem quite as heavy as it might when one is, a bit younger. So I don't. It's an interesting argument, but it's one I have trouble really relating to, I guess. Which.
Well, I'm still quite young, so let's say I decide to accept the subjectivist argument, and let's say I have some experience, and I decide to interpret this experience as something that's coming from God. Mm-hmm. At that point, I'm taking on what I think is a big risk in terms of the sort of structure of my beliefs, which have hitherto been subject to methodological naturalism. Right. Something that I could count on. It seems that I would be setting myself up for a really nasty crash, potentially.
It's possible, but that would depend on. You're not going to do that as an intellectual exercise. You're not going to wake up one day and say, "Oh, let me try the God thing. I think I'll believe in God." That simply doesn't happen. So what would happen in between you holding the positions you hold now and switching to a different structural basis of belief would be something that would convince you to go there. And that something, whatever it is, would mitigate that risk. The risk is there, I understand that, but it would be highly mitigated by the benefit. I mean, everything's a risk-benefit situation. It would be highly mitigated by the benefit of whatever it was that occurred to you, that came to you, that possessed you, whatever it might be, the experience that you had, that would just seem right. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Now, is it possible that you would go through all of that and you'd be really happy for a few years, and then something else would happen and you would say, well, I made a mistake? Yeah, that's possible. But again, I think, we have to be brave in this life. We have to be able to face these risks, and we have to take leaps, not just leaps of faith, but leaps of all kinds. And we have to explore as much as we can. So I'm not too worried about that. And I think people should be encouraged to, proceed in life with bravery, with courage. And
well, there is a fine line, though, between courage and foolishness.
Yeah, I don't think it's that bad to be foolish sometimes. I shouldn't tell you this because you're a graduate student, so don't be foolish now. But later on, people have made some great discoveries by pursuing foolishness, as you well know.
Dr. Garte, one of the criticisms that has been coming up, and we'll try to get into some questions here, but one of the criticisms that come up that deals with the belief of God, and you're asking, why, what is wrong if I have that belief? What can be the detrimental effects?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, there's the intellectual thing. There's obviously we want to have beliefs that comport with reality. We want to have truth-making abilities, and we want to think that we have truth, right? A belief
Mm-hmm.
is something that we believe true. But one of the criticisms that out there and people have been asking is that if people have these religious beliefs and it filters over to secular society such that there's an encroachment in the academics, in the sciences, how do you feel about that? Because that, I think, is a little bit of concern, because obviously not everybody has the same religious beliefs. And when you start having all these different religious beliefs, and it's not just the individual person that holds to them, it's the fact that it carries over to the secular society.
Well, that's a fear that I think is highly unfounded for several reasons. First of all, at least for now, and I'm not saying it's going to always be that way, the academic milieu is incredibly non-theistic and anti-theistic, so that's not a danger. But even if it were a danger, I mean, I have been at meetings, at scientific meetings, with peers from all over the world. I've sat on panels of various kinds, advisory boards, etc., with Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Christians, atheists. Nobody knew who believed what. Nobody cared who believed what. That's one thing about science that is so beautiful, and I think Casey is probably already aware of some of this. It's a community in a way that very few other communities are. We all agree on the method that we find truth. We all agree on what makes a good scientific paper. I mean, there are some differences in some cases, but generally, if you present a scientific proposal to a group of your peers of all religions, of all political views, of all nationalities, you can have Israelis and Arabs, and I've seen that many times in review panels. Everything else goes out the window. What only is left is this a good proposal scientifically or not? And if anybody would dare, I've almost never seen this happen, but if anybody dares say, well, I don't like this because it's politically, as Casey said early at the beginning, it's politically oppressive to some group, they'd be thrown out of the room. I mean, that's not how science works. So I'm not at all worried about religion encroaching, as you said, into the scientific domain. And in fact, other scientists like Francis Collins, who's the head of NIH, and many other Christian scientists who I know quite well, whenever they're asked these questions, they kind of look the same. They have the same response I have. That's insane. That would never happen. We go into the lab and we do science. We don't pray. Oh, well, actually, everybody prays in the lab, but that's another story. Even atheists. But there's no encroachment going on. Now, I thought you were going to ask about encroachment into the social world of what about Christianity? telling people how to live, passing laws that are pro-Christian, etc. Again,
yes, that seems to me a much bigger danger than the science one. I agree with you on the science thing.
Yeah, no, I would agree as well. But I mean, I don't agree that there is an encroachment. I think it's an idealistic approach. What I think that obviously any scientist should go into the lab and leave their religious beliefs at the door, but I don't think that actually happens in practice altogether. But I do agree. Why don't you discuss the social aspects? I agree with you. I think that's a far greater threat.
But before I do that, let me just explain why it really is true in science. If you go into the lab and you, for some reason, decide that you're going to follow some religious precept in doing your experiments, it's natural selection takes over. Okay, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to get anything done. You're not going to find any data. So that's it. You're done. You're out. I should say that I know people. I've had graduate students who, stopped being graduate students because not necessarily for religion, but for various extra scientific reasons, couldn't deal with that, and so they had to leave.
Yeah, I agree with you. Experimentally, I think more along the lines of science the religiosity encroaching on the science more in the academic teaching. For example, people not wanting to talk about evolution, people not teaching evolution, that kind of stuff, rather than the experimental sciences.
Yeah,
that I think
and that is a problem.
Thing. Right,
that's
where I think King Crocoduck
I got that. Yeah.
So,
yes, although I would actually suggest, and I would probably take Sai's side here. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to preempt whatever you'll say. Because I think we're mostly going to be on the same side on this point. I do think that religious moderates, the religious people who accept evolution, have a significant role to play in rehabilitating evolution in the eyes of the Christian community.
You're absolutely right, Casey, and that's actually one of my goals, is to educate other Christians that evolution is not the enemy of faith. It's not the enemy of Christ. Nothing that's true in this world can be the enemy of God, because it's God's creation. I'm speaking now to the Christians in the audience. So to deny evolution, to deny the Big Bang, to deny scientific reality is not what Christ wants us to do. It's going in the wrong direction. And I would just say again, to further strengthen your point, Casey, is that let's not forget that the key witness in the Dover trial that I believe pretty much swayed the judge was a Christian, Ken Miller, another evolutionary creationist like I am, and Biologos and many other people.
Yes, Catholic.
And his testimony was persuasive. All the atheists in the world could have gotten up and said things about evolution, and they would have been counted, well, that's just atheist propaganda, but they couldn't say that to him. And I think we, as you said, moderate Christians or scientific Christians, can have a great role in preventing and helping Christians to see that, I don't want to get into theology because that's a whole other issue, but that even theologically, the idea that the earth has to be 6,000 years old and all the other stuff it's an interpretation. It's not necessarily real, but that's a tangent, and I would go into that with more with another Christian rather than with this.
Yes. Just so it's clear to everyone, given the context of the discussion, my rejection of religion has always been philosophical rather than scientific. It's always been based on the methodology that I employ in acquiring knowledge and the constraints that places upon what I'm willing to accept as knowledge.
Now, in terms of the encroachment into getting back to Steve's question or the question from the audience of the encroachment of religion, or Christianity in particular, into the social sphere, that's a problem. And that's something that many Christians are as concerned with as people who are not religious. Let's not forget that the separation clause was insisted upon by Christians, because there were, by the time the Constitution was being written, there were many different Protestant denominations who were vying for position and power, and the idea of having the separation clause was to prevent the establishment of the Quakers, or well, that wouldn't be the Quakers, but of the Puritans or Catholics or any other group within the Christian faith that would take dominance. So I think that the diversity of Christianity is a strength. And even within a particular denomination, for example, I'm a member of the United Methodist Church, and it's a very large church worldwide, and it has tremendous diversity of opinion on social issues. So diverse that there's even the possibility of some, major breaking off of different groups, and that has happened in other groups, in other denominations. So what I'm saying is that what is necessary is for people who agree that the non-establishment clause, the separation clause of the Constitution is vital, and that includes Christians as well as non-Christians. It includes other people of other religions as well, that those people form alliances to make sure that we don't have encroachment of any religious view. And that includes, by the way, Islamic views, which, of course, in some parts of the world, that's a real problem, much more a real problem than we have anything in the U.S.
Yes.
Talking about Sharia law being imposed. So that I agree that has to be resisted, and not to now. At the same time, we do need to guarantee freedom of religion, and that means that without encroachment, there should be no sense among anybody of any religious belief, including no religious belief, that their beliefs are sacred. They should not be restrained from exercising their own beliefs, assuming, of course, that they're legal and not detrimental.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in what you just said across the board, and I'm happy there are moderate people out there, both sides, because I happen to agree with everything you just said. I think Kyle had a question or two he was trying to get in, and I think his mic was a little cutting out, so you want to let him jump in there for a second?
He actually answered it. I was going to try to follow up with the social aspect of it, so he actually beat me to it.
Yeah. I just want to generalize what Sai said in a political context. That is that the function of a liberal democracy is to allow everyone to pursue their own private conception of the good, within reason, of course. And that when you don't have these kinds of guarantees, you get very nasty figures, both on the left and on the right, coming in and ruining everybody's day. So if for no other reason than self-interest, people should be guaranteeing each other's rights in that respect.
Absolutely.
Right. Good. Well, that was an ezy question. We all agreed. Is there another one?
Yes, we
do have more. Yes, Kyle.
Somehow I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and I want to point out, I love discussions like this where they don't necessarily have to be adversarial. They're not a debate structure. I mean, I am just as much interested by two people from different sides of the fence having an agreement, rather than a disagreement, just as much. I find it fascinating. So yeah. I'm thrilled to have these kinds of discussions.
Right, I wish I could express myself better, but unfortunately, it's been an exhausting week, and I apologize if I'm slurring a little bit.
Needed. You sound just fine.
Okay,
Go ahead,
Dr. Garte, how do you when you compare subjective positions against each other, is there any objective measure to verify their validity?
By comparing an objective measure to compare two subjective, I assume two differing subjective experiences?
Correct.
I don't see how that would work, because I think that the whole idea of a subjective epistemology is that it's subjective. So testing a subjective view of reality by objective means, let me just give a story. This may sound familiar if you watched my discussion with Aaron Ra, because I brought it up to him. One of the things that I'm very concerned about, both as a religious person, but also as a scientist, is what's often called scientism, the idea that, science answers everything, all questions. And I asked an atheist who I was talking to online what objective measure he would use to evaluate the value of, or he would evaluate the quality of a painting, say compared to another painting. Which painting is better? how would you do that objectively, using the scientific method? And he said, it's very easy. Just find out the market value, the price of both paintings, and whichever one costs more is better. And when I told that to Aaron, he burst into hysterics.
That's pretty funny, actually.
And
I thought that was
I
funny.
had to swear that I wasn't lying, that this was a real conversation. And he made some good comments. But and that's an extreme view. I would not say that very many atheists would go that route. But I think what it illustrates is this idea that objective measures can be extremely important, but not can be, they are extremely important, as I said at the very beginning, in understanding how the world works in every aspect of it. But no, I don't see how you would apply that to subjective experiences.
In fairness, though, I have read some literature talking about how there may be naturalistic origins to our aesthetic preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So, and I think generally when we speak of social particulars, when we speak of things that could actually properly be called socially constructed, we find often that these things are downstream our natural history.
What do you think aesthetic preferences could have came from things like evolution as far as sexual selection?
To a certain degree, yeah. I mean, evolution can't explain why Michelangelo was good at sculptures and why Leonardo da Vinci was good at paintings, but it could certainly contribute to our understanding of why people tend to prefer their work to, say, Andy Warhol's or Jackson Pollock's.
Absolutely.
Here's where we may finally have some disagreement. I'm, of course, a very strong evolutionary biologist. I really hold deeply to the theory of evolution, but I consider it a uniquely biological theory, and a lot of people disagree with me. And the reason I think of that is because the biochemical mechanism of evolution, which is often not understood, is purely biological. It does not occur in any other system. And I don't reject everything that, for example, evolutionary psychology purports to be true. Some of it may very well be true, but the problem is that much of it is just so stories. And your question, Steve, about aesthetic preferences reminds me of one example that's often used about the dangers of evolutionary psychology in general is the question of why do women prefer pink and men prefer, or women and girls, females prefer pink, while boys prefer blue and cooler colors. And the theory that came up, which sounded very reasonable, as almost all of them do, is that women it was advantageous, selective advantage for women to be able to recognize berries because they were the ones out foraging for berries and that kind of food. And so most berries are red, so red was considered, and that sounds perfectly good, right? It's great. It might be true, but in fact it's not true, because it turns out that the female preference for pink and red is about 100 years old in the United States. Before that, pink was considered a highly masculine color. So,
well, let me offer.
There's a real problem with the just so stories, and there are other examples like that where it turns out they don't work.
Let me try to offer a defense of evolutionary psychology. I think it's the case that all evolutionary explanations begin to some degree as a just so story. The difference is that they have to be tested.
Right.
Let's take the flounder. As far as I'm aware, there's no evolutionary explanation that's been accepted yet that tells us why the flounder, why the eye migrates from one side of the flounder's head to the other. Yeah, I might be wrong, but from what I understand, there hasn't been an explanation devised yet. That being said, is there anybody who seriously doubts that there's an evolutionary story to be told?
Oh, you're right. And in fact, there is, on the flounder case, there are some stories which which could very well likely be true, but they have not been tested rigorously. And that's, as what you said is right. They have to be, all of these evolutionary scenarios have to really be tested, both for the reality of the selective advantage and eventually for the genetic mechanism that leads to that.
Yes.
And we have that data. We have that evidence for vast numbers of evolutionary changes. We have both the selective advantage and the absolute genetic data, which is just confirms it all. The problem with evolutionary psychology is that it is based on the idea that human beings, being animals and having existed for whatever number of years you want to use, depending on what you define as human, have been subject to behavioral selective pressures. So, the best example is, of course, is sexual selection, as Steve said. And, larger men are favored because they're more likely to provide protection and, lead to reproduction, etc. And there's so many of these. And some of those are probably accurate. Why wouldn't they be? They're also taken from analogies in the non-human world. And we see explanations of a lot of things. But it breaks down all over the place. Because, first of all, some of the behaviors that are being talked about are fairly recent. And there's been very little evolution, genetic evolution, biological evolution in human beings in the last 100,000 years. There have been 2 or 3 mutations that are still in the process of being fixed, such as the ability to drink milk. Skin color is a big one, but that's under huge selection pressure. So there hasn't been a lot of evolution of genetic change in the human population since 100,000 years ago, which is a very short period of time, of course. So when you talk about this, probably humans evolved to do this, and you're talking about a situation that didn't even exist until 30, 40,000 years ago, no, it can't happen. There isn't enough time. So in some cases, these things can be dismissed out of hand. And the problem is that in the urge to come up with things like explanations of morality, explanations of altruism, people are coming up with, the spandrel. I don't know if you know the spandrel theory of Dawkins, and how kin selection can be expanded to the whole population of humans. These are speculations.
That's the one that, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the one that goes, I will die for 2 of my brothers or 8 of my cousins, something like that?
Yeah, and that one is not so far off, but why do you die for 1 complete stranger? And the answer to that is it's a carry, it's a spandrel. In other words, it's an unintentional genetic carryover in what's called a selective sweep, where the gene for whatever it is that causes you to be altruistic, and we don't know those genes, but those genes somehow got carried over with the kin selection genes. Kin selection is probably real to some extent. That makes a lot of sense, and that goes way back in animal history. So yeah, but the kind of morality, the kind of altruism that humans display, modern humans display, and ancient humans displayed, is very difficult to explain on the basis of biological evolution.
Do you suggest that in the selective sweep that trait is a ride-along that gets fixated in the population? Okay.
That's not my. That's Dawkins.
Right.
I don't know whether he originated it, but he's.
No, I don't think he originated, but that's kind of what he was trying to advocate during. I think exactly the selfish gene and
which is an interesting idea. There's no evidence for it.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I do acknowledge that certainly in the early years, evolutionary psychology did have a lot of crap coming out. That's not deniable. But I do think that in recent years, it's really gotten a lot better. You see a lot of cluster sampling. You see 3x4 designs. You see, you see they're very methodologically rigorous. And when the meta-analyses are performed, there are interesting results that are panning out. I want to recommend, maybe this will be interesting to you. There's a YouTube channel called Gadsod. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No.
Well, he's an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Montreal who applies evolutionary psychology to consumer behavior. And he's got a series called The Sod Truth, and I think you would enjoy it. It's not speculative nonsense like you would get with the pink and blue thing.
Right.
there are interesting results coming out of these fields that I think, I wouldn't say that we should structure our morality and our policies around whatever the snarl word is biological determinism. I don't accept that term, but it should inform our understanding of how people behave and why. Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind is one that I really like. It's I don't know if you read that book, but he talks about evolution of groupish behavior. So
I mean, you're right. I mean, there are things that, as I said at the beginning, a lot of it is perfectly good science, and it especially the parts that go back to primates or even earlier mammalian characteristics and behavioral traits that have carried through either untouched or slightly modified. And I think that when you're dealing with that kind of evidence, then you have a real story. So I really, my main complaint is the stuff that isn't that way, and a lot of that comes from attempts to explain human morality.
Would you still hold to? Do you hold for the modern evolutionary synthesis the just so story as what Gould would have described Darwinism as, or Lamarckism as? I mean, do you still subscribe that there is that just so story narrative that they were trying to refer to as, why certain things have the certain characteristics they have?
Okay, that's a very, very large question.
Yeah, I know we could be here for several hours on the test.
I'll just try to answer it quickly and say that, Gould and Dawkins had a huge disagreement about the adaptationist paradigm. Gould correctly, in my view, argued that adaptation is not the only thing that drives evolution, and I think the evidence for that is overwhelming, and most evolutionary biologists, accept neutral evolution. And in terms of the modern synthesis, I mean, one of the things I've written about and published is about the extended evolutionary synthesis, which is, I believe, filling some of the gaps that were left by the modern synthesis and neo-Darwinism, where, we understand very well about how natural selection works, but we never got a good handle on how innovation occurs. How do you get the first wing or the first feather? What mechanisms occur? And then we are now finding those mechanisms. Those mechanisms are now being discovered. They're fascinating.
Do you think the extended synthesis is part of MES, or you think that's something that should be added separately?
Well, that's the big debate.
Right.
Nobody denies that any of this is real. The debate is, do you need a separate word, or is it just Darwinism expanded? Well, that's semantics. I don't care. What I like is that evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology is now in a wonderful state of discovery and expansion, and many of the problems that evolution has faced over a long time are going to be solved. They're being solved as we speak.
I agree with you 1,000% on that.
Ultimately, our selection of this or that model is going to come down to methodological soundness and predictive capabilities.
Yeah. I mean, fascinating story is the origin of pregnancy in mammals, and it turns out, that's a huge change. I mean, you can't just do one thing. Some creationists have claimed, well, how did people start getting pregnant? There's so many things that have to happen at once. And that's true. And it turns out that you take one retrotransposon and you stick it into a particular gene regulatory network, you're changing the expression of about 12 different genes, and boom, you get all these different structures that never occurred before. So, that kind of exciting data is where evolutionary biology is now headed.
Cool. So shall we wrap up then? I think we've mostly exhausted.
I'm definitely at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fascinating, and I'm the funniest thing is these questions could probably end up having 2-hour hangouts just on them alone, right? So I know we were very superficial on a lot of these things, and I agree that you guys agree on a lot of things. So maybe next time we'll have to figure out something where you don't agree upon. I know we didn't touch much on abiogenesis, which is fine, but I thought what we did touch on was fantastic. Let's wrap this up. Any other quick questions before we do? Yep.
Next time, I propose next time we talk more about quantum philosophy. I think that would make for interesting conversation.
Wow. I love that.
Is it wait? So maybe like what, Bohemian versus like Copenhagen kind of thing, or what?
Well, I don't know if Dr. Garte subscribes to Copenhagen or the consciousness causes collapse, the Wigner interpretation. There's often a confusion between the.
I would love to get in that.
Yeah.
Well, in my naive understanding of quantum mechanics, not being a physicist, I kind of like the Copenhagen interpretation. But we can't start on that now.
Well, I'll tell you what. We'll have one on pilot wave theory in the Copenhagen next time. I think that'd be awesome.
There is an interesting, I guess, viewpoint that Dr. Garte does have. And we talked about it in our preliminary talks about coming on the show, and I think we should have him back for this particular discussion.
Well, somebody's banging on a desk, so I don't think anybody can hear you. It sounds like a stampede.
You can't hear me now?
There was like a stampede going.
Now.
Okay, now we got you.
Well, Dr. Garte has a what he thinks is a controversial view. I'm sure that it would make for an interesting discussion, and we kind of talked about it on our preliminary talks. So I think it would be cool to have him come back and do this actual discussion. Dr. Garte, do you want to kind of briefly tell what your viewpoint on the race as a biological construct is?
Okay. This is kind of late to say this, but actually I prefer you just call me Cy. That's what everybody calls me. So, I mean, it's fine. One of the things that I found myself getting involved in when I was doing research in population genetics was the issue of genetics of race. And what happened was my group had discovered a new polymorphism in a very important gene that was limited only to people of African descent. So that led me off onto this topic of trying to understand what race is in the genetic terms. And what I found out was that race is not genetic. It has no biological meaning. It's a cultural construct. And I've given talks on that, and I've recently had a brief article published on it. I gave a talk at the Smithsonian, which I think you saw, on this. And so that's basically my view. It sounds very political, but it's actually the way I talk about it is purely scientific. It happens.
A topic for another time. Absolutely.
Yes,
realism, sure.
I want to be part of that because I've done a survey of the literature, at least the most cited literature on this, and I think I'm broadly in agreement. I would call myself a population naturalist, in contrast to both the eliminativism. Well, there are three other positions. There's the Lewontian eliminativism. There's the race realism. There's the cultural constructivism. And then somewhere in between, there's the population naturalism. It's a kind of a compromise, a kind of context-dependent view of race. In some instances, the concept, particularly where medicine is concerned, maybe the concept is more useful, and the concept will change. So what's called a race, whatever genetic clusters you form in one set of conditions, that'll sort of define race for that particular context. It'll be useful in that context, but it won't be applicable to other contexts. So
definitely.
So that would.
We'll have you both on back for that, and then we'll find somebody that holds the opposite view, and we can.
Jean-Francois Harpe, bring him on.
Can you say that again, Francois?
that French dude.
Francois.
We will reach out to him. I think it would be.
There are a few American population geneticists who also have a different view. So, but I don't think they would come on. So.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. This was fascinating. We had 200 people watching. There probably will be an after show tonight. We were going to have a pre-show talking about some Twitter stuff earlier. Unfortunately, we wanted to focus more on this discussion and not make the pre-show part of this. So later on tonight, maybe about an hour or so, on my channel, Steve McRae, if anyone wants to join, we'll be talking about not only this as an after show, but some of the tweeter things that have been coming up lately that I've.
He's ready to get into his spiel about Twitter. He's been
Twitter days, yes, because we all love our Twitter.
But yes, thank you, Casey and Ty, for coming on and being part of this. It was very interesting, and it's kind of cool to have two people who hold opposing religious beliefs actually agree on so much. We're not so vastly different after all, I don't think.
Why can't we be friends?
All right.
Stick to physics, Casey. Don't go into music.